For more on what this IPO means for Wall Street and the broader space economy, we're joined by Andrew Chanin, CEO of ProcureAM, and Wendy Whitman, Cobb, Professor of Strategy and Security Studies at the U.S. Air Force School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. Thank you both for making the time today. Let's start with you first, Andrew. Why is this not just another IPO?
So, as you thoroughly mentioned before this segment, this is the biggest IPO in the history of the stock markets. And not only that, but for the space industry, this is representative of the largest, probably most accomplished space company over the last few decades. And what they've done for the broad space industry and bringing down the cost of launch and the cost of accessing space has opened up a tremendous marketplace for not just SpaceX, but for many clients and future clients. So for this is one of the first times that many investors will be able to get access to this company. And there's a lot of excitement around that.
Absolutely. And Professor Whitman Cobb, let's bring you in as well. Some analysts are describing this as a Netscape moment for the space industry. Put that into context for us. Why could this IPO be a big moment for the space economy?
Yeah, the space economy has really been something that has only ballooned into what it is now in over the past decade. While private companies and commercial industries have always had some role, especially in the United States space program, we've only really seen the beginning of it with SpaceX and their success. And they really represent this sort of new approach to space that is innovative, fast moving, low cost, really enabling a lot of different things. And so this is really something we haven't seen before in space and is indicative of where I think a lot of people hope the space economy is going to go, with more companies like this going public, doing these sorts of things that lead to more achievements in the space domain.
So many things are unusual about this IPO. Andrew, back to you. What do you make of SpaceX allocating 20% of its shares to everyday investors, when we know typically IPOs, they said about 5 to 10% to retail investors? And this, as you know, we're seeing a valuation of $1.77 trillion following the IPO price. I mean, when you compare this with other companies, for example, NVIDIA, valued at $5 trillion, and that is about 24 times of its revenue last year. And then you got SpaceX, 110 times of its revenue. I mean, what is this telling you?
That this is a company that is in demand. There are investors that have been trying to get exposure to this company for many years, but it's been extremely difficult to get direct access to the cap table for this company. Many people have resorted to trying to find SPVs, which could be very high fee. Yes, it is a large percentage of a retail allocation, but possibly even a little bit less than they were thinking that maybe they would allocate towards. But that could be because there's very strong institutional demand. And so while there's a very little float that's going to be available immediately, and that could lead to potential volatility out of the gate, this is something that I think many critics of the company historically have said that because it has been so tightly owned by so few people, that when SpaceX succeeds, that maybe not as many people are benefiting from it. But by opening this up to many more shareholders, and not just American shareholders, but shareholders around the world, could allow for many more stakeholders and beneficiaries as this company proceeds into the future. So I think that that's something that is very new for this company, but something that clearly it seems that Elon Musk wants to make sure that this is a company that, if it is successful, that more people can share in those wins directly.
Yeah, Andrew, just building on that, I mean, opening this up to more shareholders. At the same time, Elon Musk, he's going to be controlling more than 80% of SpaceX's voting shares. He's CEO, CTO, board chairman. There's no designated successor, no second in command, as we know so far. So basically, the world's most valuable IPO depends on this one man. So how do you view this concentration of authority when it comes to governance and innovation? And at what point does this become, you know, a risk rather than a competitive advantage?
So time will tell for that, but we've seen numerous other companies before where they issue things like founder shares that give significantly more control to some of those early leaders of that company. And shareholders have lined up to purchase shares of those companies. Palantir being a fairly recent one that had seen its share price go from south of $7 to becoming a multi-billion-dollar company in just a few years of being public. And so ultimately, I think when you look at track record and how these CEOs perform under pressure in different types of scenarios, these are things that shareholders have that option. If you don't like that, you can not invest in it. As a publicly traded company, you could short that company. You could buy options to play either type of directional play. And there's also going to be ETFs coming out of the gate very soon that are leverage long and leverage short plays on just single stock SpaceX. So there will be many ways for investors to be able to express their opinions on the company. And some people will try to avoid it. But like you also mentioned, many people might get exposure through broad-based indexes as well, whether they like it or not. That said, ultimately, like we've seen with Tesla, shareholders have the ability to vote with their feet and vote with their shares, maybe not at the same 1-to-1 ratio as the founder, but sometimes these leaders know their company best. And so time will tell how this plays out. But so far, investors in his other companies many times have rewarded some of the things that maybe critics outside the company say, oh, no, you shouldn't vote for this. And sure enough, he ends up getting enough votes from their shareholders that end up pushing his agenda in the same direction that he wants to move.
Okay. Professor Whitman Cobb, speaking of concentration of influence, I mean, the public sector is deeply entangled here as well. NASA relies heavily on SpaceX. The Pentagon depends on Starlink. As SpaceX grows even larger post-IPO, how should policymakers think about the risks as well as benefits of relying so heavily on a single private company?
Yeah, certainly we've seen a lot of benefits. There's, doing things like Artemis, doing things like space-based communications. SpaceX has been able to bring those costs down. So doing something like going back to the moon is a lot lower cost than we might have otherwise expected. So there are a lot of great benefits that we get, not just from relying on commercial space generally, but SpaceX in particular, that has been really innovative and really cutting edge and really disruptive in this area. But I think we've seen with Elon Musk over the years, there is some risk of with him in terms of how much control he has over the companies. And so even within Ukraine, there was a point in time not too long ago where he threatened to withdraw Starlink access for Ukrainians and did in particular geographic areas. And, if you're going to depend to a significant extent on one company and therefore one man, there is some concern there. The European Space Agency has been concerned as they've started to encourage a European private commercial market for space not to sort of put all of their eggs in one basket. So I do think we've seen concern globally about this. And, I think in the United States, there have been efforts to diversify options. So with Artemis in particular and NASA's plans to return to the moon, they're not just relying on SpaceX. They're also hoping that Blue Origin is able to develop a lunar landing capacity in the near future. And so they aren't reliant so much on SpaceX and how far they get along here with Starship. So there are definitely great benefits, but risks that I think a lot of people in the policy world here in the United States have been looking at ways to sort of mitigate, whether it's diversifying access or encouraging other companies to compete.
Okay. And Professor, given your insight into space capabilities, I want to ask you, when we look at the actual roadmap laid out in the filing, it mentions orbital data centers, lunar industries, and Mars settlements. Which of these ideas look realistic over the next decade and which are still a long way off?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question because if you think about what we expected space to be back in the 1960s, we definitely had much grander visions of what we would see 50, 60 years down the line. And what we've seen throughout space history is that grand projects typically take much longer to develop, typically aren't as grand as they want to be, and are often way late and over budget. That being said, SpaceX does have a way, as they say, of making things that seem impossible simply late. So within the next decade, data centers are probably most likely. There are some engineering challenges there. NASA has laid out a roadmap for lunar exploration and the establishment of lunar bases over the next 10 years. So that's probably realistic. Anything larger than that, though, is probably getting beyond that time scale. And eventually, I'm sure SpaceX and others will be able to solve the challenges that are inherent with doing these big engineering projects. But it's going to take a lot more time and money than I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, finally. And Andrew, I'd just like to build, on what Professor said. So really, how will these plans, which obviously need a longer time to realize, then affect SpaceX now as a public company? I mean, how are investors to gauge its actual growth and profitability, or do they just have to have blind faith? I mean, how do we even begin to benchmark it? Is it against other aerospace companies or communication companies, given, Starlink, or then AI companies, perhaps, seeing as how XAI is a huge part of SpaceX too? And is a Starlink business enough to keep investors happy, you think?
So there's Starlink, there's Starshield, there's government contracts, there are commercial clients lining up. We even saw many people thought that when Project Kuiper out of Amazon was coming forward, that they thought that most of the launch capacity would get sucked up by Blue Origin just because of the Jeff Bezos affiliation. However, companies realize that diversification is important, just like many investors look for diversification in their own investment strategies. SpaceX, however, when you look at something such as compute in orbit, is extremely well positioned to potentially be one of the first companies to be able to achieve those goals. So when you think about the capabilities of just having their own launch capabilities in-house, that's a tremendous leg up on many other companies that are looking to do things in the world of compute. And so, there are many aspects. People always like to look at, if you pull all the parts, pieces apart, how much are those individual companies worth? But a company like SpaceX is very strategically trying to take on these other acquisitions and mergers because they have some type of vision out there for what they might be able to utilize with those companies if they have them in-house. And vertical integration is something that they've been moving towards consistently over time. So as far as what the right valuation is, where they may be in 10 years, is anyone's guess. But there could be other opportunities that they haven't really drilled into that could be, multi-trillion-dollar industries, like gathering solar energy in space and sending it back down to Earth. Because energy for these massive data centers, XAI having, some of the biggest needs of companies out there for compute as well as for energy in order to power these massive build outs, that might be enough of a reason for them to try to get into an industry like that. And so sometimes when SpaceX wins, humanity wins as well. And so we're certainly rooting for SpaceX and the many other really exciting space companies out there around the world that are trying to solve very difficult problems in the near term and hopefully the long term as well.
Okay, we will continue to watch this story, of course. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today and for the great conversation. We've been speaking to Mr. Chanin and Professor Whitman Cobb.